Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and apologies for the slight delay for starting tonight's show. We had some technical difficulties, but you are in safe hands from now. Ash Sarkar, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
What was the technical difficulty, Michael? Did Dan Wootton hold you at gunpoint or something? What's going on?
Well, I have to say, it looks like I am now blaming my production team, but Fox, my producer, told me to blame technical issues. I was actually talking to Piers Morgan, and they kept me for 15 minutes late. I'll be going up this evening. I think it went okay. Coming up later tonight, Rishi Sunak has used a keynote speech today to say the country would not be safe under Keir Starmer. Shocking details of conditions at an Israeli detention centre have been revealed, and we look at what went on with Israel at Eurovision at the weekend. Stay tuned for all of that. Labour's position on the Gaza war has been all over the place. Keir Starmer infamously said Israel has the right to cut off fuel and water to Palestinians before spending months denying he had. Right? That's the clearest example that they're all over the place. However, while there has been no sign of moral integrity, there has been some consistency in the Labour position. That is, whatever Washington says, Labour will go along with it. Now, that fact was again made clear this weekend when Shadow Minister Jonathan Ashworth appeared on Sky News.
I do not want to see an offensive go into Rafah. And also, let me tell you this, I certainly don't want to see British-made weapons, British-made components which are part of weapons, be used in any full-scale offensive into Rafah. So I think the government, like the Americans have, should say that they will not sell those arms for use in Rafah.
So that is the Labour position now, that you would call for a suspension of arms sales, stop export licenses for components for weapons that could be used by Israel?
We do not want to see weapons used in Rafah. Okay. And like Joe Biden has said, if that goes ahead, those weapons should be halted. And we believe that the government should adopt that position now.
But some of those weapons have already gone. I suppose what I'm asking you about is, should there now be an export ban on weapons or components of weapons to Israel from the UK?
I'm talking about weapons and components that can be used in weapons, British-made, that can be those weapons that could be used in Rafah. We do not want those weapons to be sold. So we hope the government, we're calling on the government. We've already called on the government, as you know, to publish its legal advice more generally about arms. But just as the Americans have said, they're halting shipments and saying that shipments will not go ahead if the Rafah offensive goes ahead, as we all fear.
So to be
the
clear,
government should adopt that position.
Okay, we should do it the same as the Americans right now.
The government should adopt the position. We have got to put pressure on to stop this offensive into Rafah going ahead. It will be catastrophic, and
I'm just trying to get absolutely clear on this. Should we pause arms sales to Israel or not?
We should.
Yes or no?
We should be pausing arms sales in order to stop to any arms that would be used in that Rafah offensive.
What is the point in having a Labour politician turn up to speak to TV news if literally their position is whatever Joe Biden says, we'll say it? And then if what Joe Biden has said is slightly different to what our government has said, will sound really tough. We think our government should adopt this position. Why? Oh, because Joe Biden said it yesterday, and we think that our government should do whatever Joe Biden does. There is, as I say, there's coherence to this position in the sense that it's been consistent. Every time Joe Biden says something, Labour says it too. Until Joe Biden says, oh, it's time for a ceasefire, Labour say, oh, we couldn't possibly have a ceasefire. That would freeze things as they are. That would be terrible. That would be giving Hamas free rein. Biden says, oh, actually, we think maybe let's have a ceasefire. Like, oh, we need a ceasefire. The government must call for a ceasefire. And they've obviously been arguing for ages that we should be sending arms to Israel. Now Joe Biden has said, it's stupid, as we'll go on to. It's fairly meaningless. We'll stop sending arms which might be used in Rafah. What's the difference between bombing a family in Rafah and bombing a family in Gaza City, right? Pretty much the same. It definitely takes the same weaponry. So this idea that this weapon could be used in Rafah, whereas this weapon could only be used in Gaza City, it's a stupid position. It, of course, comes just days after US President Joe Biden halted the transfer of a relatively small number of American weapons to Israel. Biden has also threatened to halt some further arms shipments to Israel if a full offensive in Rafah goes ahead. Now, full, of course, is an interesting word, and it seems to be a get-out-of-jail-free card. This is because Israeli troops have been bombing, shelling and shooting in the southern city since last week. Labour's shift in stance also comes in the wake of an admission from the White House. The Biden administration has said that it's reasonable to conclude that Israel has used American weapons in Gaza in ways that contravene international humanitarian law. On Sky, Trevor Phillips put those findings to Foreign Secretary David Cameron.
The State Department has released a report in the last 48 hours in which they say, I'm quoting here, it says, it was reasonable to assess that Israel had used American weaponry in a way that was inconsistent with international law. President Biden has essentially pressed pause on the movement of arms to Israel. Wouldn't it be wise for us to do the same?
Well, I think America and the UK are in a totally different situation. The United States is a massive bulk state supplier of weapons to Israel, including, 1,000-pound bombs and all the rest of it. The UK provides less than 1% of Israel's weapons, and is not a state supplier. We have a licensing system, and those licenses can be closed if it's judged there's a serious risk of a serious international human rights.
The speech that you gave last week that I referred to, actually, you made the point that though we weren't in the same position as the United States in various ways, our decisions are not all looked at all over the world.
Yeah.
Our position is influential, and our action, symbolic as it might be, is significant. So
if you're saying to me, why not, never mind your detailed process, which we have, and I think that's the right way to go. If you're saying to me, why not have a, political declaration now to have an immediate arms embargo? Well, I was pressed to do that a few months ago, and the very next thing that happened just a few days later was a massive Iranian attack on Israel, including 140 cruise missiles. So I don't think it would have been a wise path, and I still don't think it would be a wise path. I mean, if I announced that today, it might help me get through this television interview, but actually it would strengthen Hamas, it would weaken Israel. I think it would probably make a hostage deal less likely. So I don't think some sort of political declaration is the right answer. We should stick with our rigorous process of making sure we act within the law.
Now, that was a 2-minute clip. And I think there was a number of contradictions in it, right? So we started saying, are we going to stop sending arms to Israel? Joe Biden has said he's going to stop sending some. He said, well, we're pretty irrelevant. We don't really matter. We only send them 1% of their arms anyway. It's not even us, the government, doing it. We're just licensing our arms companies to sell it. Then by the end of the clip, he said, can you imagine the significance if we had cut off arms to Israel before Iran retaliated for, basically Israel's incredibly provocative attack on their embassy, but that's a different issue. When it comes to if we'd stopped sending arms before the Iran retaliation, that would have been hugely influential. That would have been a catastrophe. But now, if we stopped arms, it would have no effect whatsoever. Which is it? Do we have an effect or do we not have an effect? You can't, when someone's saying, oh, there's a good reason to stop arms, say, oh, we don't have an effect. And when someone says, oh, well, this is the reason that you should send arms, say, oh, yeah, we're incredibly important, we're incredibly significant. Doesn't make any sense. On Politics Live, a Labour peer, also, I just want to say this, when a politician says, it might be the easy thing to help me get through this interview, I'm actually being really brave by not holding Israel to account. That's the brave thing to do, not the easy thing to do. Anyway, on Politics Live, Labour peer and human rights lawyer Helena Kennedy gave her view of Cameron's position.
I don't agree with them. I think as a matter of principle, we should be making the same decision as the United States and saying you're not going to get weapons. It's not, the licensing thing is an issue for other times where we give to allies the opportunity of trading and buying arms from us. But this is about a crisis that's happening here. And this is about people dying in huge numbers. We just saw your pictures of the Gaza has been reduced to rubble. It's pulverized. And you saw behind Joe Floto the pictures of a very different kind of nation sitting alongside it, Israel. And you really can't do this. This notion that Netanyahu is presenting, that this is the only way to deal with Hamas, is the way to actually foster Hamas and to grow new generations of disenchanted people. This is absolutely catastrophic. And it's about killing large numbers of people. This is not about, unfortunately, more people get killed. the rules of war say it must be proportionate. This is not proportionate, and we should
so
not
you
be
do believe
supporting
Israel
it.
has a right to defend itself following that
Of course.
October the 7th massacre?
Absolutely.
So where do you draw the line and stop it? If you
We've
want to get
seen-
rid of a
we've seen for
terrorist
ourselves.
organisation...
There's no question about where do you draw the line. It's visible to most people. And if you go around the country, you'll find that the majority of British people feel that what has been happening in Gaza is not a response that is appropriate. And they don't think it's going to lead to decent outcomes.
Right.
And we know that Netanyahu is captured by extreme right-wingers who are settled in places that they shouldn't be settled in. And we should be listening to what the world is saying about all of this. It is not acceptable.
That is, I think, word for word, what Emily Thornberry, what Keir Starmer, what David Lammy, what they would all be saying if they were on Politics Live and they were backbench MPs, right? I think they all believe that, right? You know, some people might think what she said is not radical enough there. I know there are some legal arguments that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself because, in fact, it is illegally occupying the Palestinian territories, right? So how can you have a right to defend yourself against an area which you are occupying, right? So there are some ambiguities there. But the argument that was made there is exactly the kind of common sense, you know, bog standard liberal argument that David Lammy, Emily Thornberry, Keir Starmer, but pretty much, I mean, maybe not the Labour Friends of Israel people who are on sort of the front bench, but the people who have a sort of background in the law, that's what they'd say. But instead, they've decided for, is it electoral reasons? To win sort of the support of the establishment, they've decided to say, whatever America says is what we're saying, and we're going to completely suspend any kind of moral integrity so that we can maintain that position, or intellectual integrity, in fact. Let's go back to Politics Live, because also on the show, Tory MP Brendan Clark-Smith, he didn't agree with Kennedy.
If I'm perfectly honest, it's not up to us to micromanage how other countries decide to fight wars as well.
You care about death, mass deaths.
Well, but we're friends.
Humanitarian crisis.
Well, but we've already said
starving people to death.
But David Cameron said that. He said that actually we want to make sure humanitarian aid is there. We want to make sure things are done in the correct way. And sometimes. But as a friend,
how many months have we been watching this going on? And people are starving, people are not getting water. We've seen the way in which there are queues of lorries waiting to go in with humanitarian aid and not being allowed through. But you can't sit there and comfortably say, this is fine. It's not fine. We're watching and bearing witness to something horrifying taking place. And we should be taking a stand as Britain in principle.
Okay, but the way to do that is through our soft power. And as I say, with a friend, sometimes you will tap them on the shoulder and you will say, actually, I think this is what you need to do, or you need to look at this again. What you're not going to make progress with is symbolically trying to scrap any sales to them when it's less than 1%.
You think that tapping on the shoulders hasn't been done? We've had a far better presence, I have to tell you, better than the Prime Minister. The big beast in the cabinet is David Cameron, and he has been tapping them on the shoulder, as has Biden's people been tapping Netanyahu on the shoulder. Netanyahu, who is looking after number one, not the nation of Israel or the people of Israel. He's in the pockets of those people, and he knows that he'll go to jail because he's wanted for embezzlement.
I think maybe Helena Kennedy was sort of understating the extent to which there is, not support for Netanyahu, but support for the style of war he is carrying out in Gaza. Ash, what do you make of this Labour policy of just saying, well, whatever Biden says, we'll say it a day after, and they're not even hiding it? He's basically saying, well, Biden said this now, so we're saying this. Is it an electoral decision? Is it a strategic decision because they want to be, the special ally of America when they're in government? What's behind it? Because it seems weird, actually.
I think it's more of a strategic decision than it is an electoral one. Because if a politician was to go out to the people of this country and say, look, what we're going to do is completely outsource our foreign policy to the White House. Whatever they say we do, we do. Whatever they say we don't do, we don't do. That would be hugely unpopular. And I think that that's a kind of common sense position, which also transcends left and right-wing voters, that many people within Westminster who work in the media are in complete denial about. And a really good example of that is after, I believe, the Manchester Arena bombing, it was when Jeremy Corbyn did a foreign policy speech where he criticised, the decade-long war on terror, the adventurous warfare, for not only destabilizing the Middle East and resulting in vast numbers of civilian casualties, but for making us less safe here. Before the speech was carried out, when it was being briefed, everyone in the media, establishment politicians, they were all saying in one voice, this is going to go down like a cup of cold sick. Actually, it went down really well because it tapped into that common sense position, which is that adventurous warfare doesn't make us more safe. And actually, outsourcing our foreign policy decision making to the White House isn't good for this country. It doesn't make people in this country more safe, and it doesn't result in wise policy making decisions either. So that's why the Labour Party are saying, well, we're really going to hold this position on Thursday, and then on Friday we're going to come out and echo whatever Biden is saying. They'll use it as a stick with which to beat the government, but they're not outright coming and saying, look, David Lammy may as well not exist because it's the US State Department who's running the show. They're not saying that because it would be electorally unpopular. The reason why it's a strategic move is because the reason why Jeremy Corbyn was dangerous to the establishment wasn't so much his domestic policies, it was his foreign policy. One, that's what he was most interested in. And two, that's where he would have made the most difference. I think he would have really, really changed Britain's geopolitical orientation, what we get up to overseas, and probably there would have been a degree of transparency over the use of our security services and military that many people in the establishment simply didn't want to see. And I think part of that quid pro quo, whether it's an explicit quid pro quo or a sort of tacitly understood one that Keir Starmer has with the establishment, it's we're going to put any vestiges of anti-imperialism in a tomb, and we are going to, pursue a ruthlessly Atlanticist orientation in our foreign policy. That's the deal with Keir Starmer's leadership. And sure, it might mean completely embarrassing volte-faces day to day, as and when the White House changes their minds. But that's the name of the game for Keir Starmer.
I think there are some issues where, Labour's position is driven by sort of elections. Well, not elections, I suppose public opinion. So sort of the fact that they're scared of saying we'll sign a sort of returns agreement with continental Europe whereby we agree to sort of share responsibility for asylum seekers. I think the reason they're not saying they'll do that, even though it's technocratically the most sensible thing to do, and on a humanitarian level the most sensible thing to do, is because they think that will be, open up vulnerabilities with the electorate. But there are issues such as taxing the rich and following or breaking free from American foreign policy, where those things are popular with the electorate. The electorate like taxing the rich. The electorate, the very rich. The electorate like breaking with American foreign policy and having our own independent sort of position in the world. Why did they vote for Brexit, right? But those are the issues where Labour, I think, I agree with you, Ash, isn't being driven by sort of what they think the electorate will or won't like. They're being driven by how do we get the establishment on side, whether or not that's the business establishment or the sort of foreign policy deep state establishment, for want of a better word. There probably is one. Let's look at the reality on the ground in Gaza, because while politicians debate whether to keep selling weapons to Israel, the IDF have begun a new assault on the northern parts of Gaza. The Jabalia refugee camp was one of the first locations that Israel invaded following October the 7th. After heavy bombardment and intense fighting, IDF leaders claimed in December that Hamas had been defeated in the north of the territory, including Jabalia. But on Saturday night, leaflets were dropped over the camp instructing 150,000 residents to evacuate south to Gaza City. Many of those residents have now followed that instruction, escaping Israeli shelling of the camp. They're heading to the coastal region west of Gaza City, where they hope to find safety. Bombardment of the camp has been intense, with residents reporting tanks now advancing on the area. Israel say they're returning soldiers to the north of Gaza because Hamas has reappeared in the area. Maybe their strategy isn't working. On LBC, Nick Ferrari asked Israel's foreign spokesperson, David Mencer, about how that had happened.
Clearly something is not working. There's a vacuum that allows Hamas to regroup, or something is not working in the IDF plan. Do you have a sense of what it might be, Mr. Mencer?
Well, I won't be sharing our battle plans with you on.
But is it right you are fighting areas where you actually fought before? Because, well,
needless to
it's
say,
not working then, is it, sir?
We've done, Nick, if you allow me to reply,
Go ahead,
we've
sir.
done everything in our power to get our hostages back. If there has been a chance to get our people back, and that has meant moving or redeploying our troops in different areas, we've tried that. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked. You know why it hasn't worked? Because a crucial element has been missing, and we are replacing that crucial element. And that is brute military force against Hamas. That's what's been effective in the past. We'll always put our hand out to peace, Nick. You know Israel better than most of your listeners. We'll always put our hand out to peace first, but it is brute military force together with negotiations which gets results.
I feel like there's no point in me even trying to debunk this idea that Israel always puts its hand out for peace first. I think everyone watching this show knows this is not true. One thing I think we can learn from this, though, which is potentially new information. So you might remember last week I spoke to Daniel Levy. So he's a former Israeli negotiator who's now very critical of the Israeli government, and he was sort of hypothesizing that it's very unlikely that Israel have destroyed all the tunnels, and that means that people will be able to go forwards and backwards, well, not forwards or backwards, but people who will have retreated, or Hamas fighters who will have retreated to Rafah will also be able to, keep continuing to go north as well. So this sort of picture we have in our head, or that I suppose I had in my head, whereby Israel is just sort of, I suppose, in stage by stage, sort of clearing out the Gaza Strip so that all of Hamas are squished into Rafah. And now the reason they have to go into Rafah, well, obviously I don't think they should go into Rafah, but the reason they say they have to go into Rafah is because that's where all the remaining Hamas people must be. Daniel Levy was saying that actually, it's probably very possible that they are moving still all through Gaza underground. And this sort of suggests that that might be the case. The brute military force that Mensa is so keen on is in evidence in the south of the Strip too, where, according to the UN, 360,000 people have now fled Israeli military action in Rafah. That's after Israel ordered the evacuation of roughly 1/3 of the area last week. The evacuation has led to medical staff abandoning the Al-Najjar hospital, one of the few medical facilities serving over 1 million displaced Palestinians in Rafah. And a new evacuation order has now been issued for medical staff at the Kuwaiti hospital. That's the largest and most overcrowded of the region's hospitals. According to the Gazan Ministry of Health, with Israeli troops now moving on the south and north of the territory, Gaza's already fragile health system could collapse within hours. 20 points behind in the polls, Rishi Sunak has today made a pretty desperate speech about why he thinks the Conservatives can still prevail at the next general election.
Now, at some point in the second half of this year, we will all go to the polls and make a choice. Not just about Conservatives versus Labour, or Sunak versus Starmer. It will be a choice between the future and the past.
That was Rishi Sunak recognising the next election can't, for him, be about the Tories versus Labour, because the public absolutely despise the Tories, and they don't mind Labour that much. They're not particularly keen on Labour, but they don't despise them nearly as much as they despise the Tories. It also can't be between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, because the public absolutely despise Rishi Sunak, and they don't mind Starmer that much. Again, they're not massively enthusiastic about Keir Starmer, but they hate Sunak much more, which means it can't be Labour v Tory, can't be Starmer v Sunak. It has to be between the future and the past, right? Now, it's a kind of a very vague and meaningless thing to say. It's also an odd argument to make for a party that's been in government for 14 years, right? If the past is that bad, maybe it's the fault of his party and it's time for a change, right? So, the past has been absolutely terrible. Let's re-elect the same government that's been in power for 14 years. Very odd, very desperate. This, however, was the real point of Rishi Sunak's speech.
The highest priority of a Conservative government is to keep our country safe. We've proudly taken the generational decision to increase defence spending to a new baseline of 2.5% of GDP by 2030. Yet Labour have refused to match our pledge. Keir Starmer supported a former Labour leader who wanted to abolish the army and withdraw from NATO. And Labour's current deputy leader, shadow foreign secretary, and many others voted against our nuclear deterrent, the ultimate guarantor of our security. Now, Labour want to pretend that this is all history, ancient history, but it's not, and it should worry us, because the defence of our country and our values requires seriousness of purpose, moral clarity, and the willingness to make big choices and sacrifices elsewhere to fund it. Either you believe the world is more dangerous, or you don't. Either you have the strength to lead, or you don't.
So very traditional sort of last minute desperate pitch from a Conservative Prime Minister. Okay, you feel poorer than you did when I entered, or when my party entered into power. We kind of messed up everything in the country. The NHS is completely on its knees. We've completely failed to build any infrastructure. The country's kind of crumbling around you. But Labour will be weak on defence. Now, fair play to him. Keir Starmer has made it somewhat difficult to make that argument. And Sunak, in fact, was later asked to clarify whether he believed the country, or Britain, would not be safe under Keir Starmer's leadership.
I believe that we will keep this country safe, and Keir Starmer's actions demonstrate that he won't be able to do that. I believe this is the most dangerous time that we've faced for generations. That's why we've made the decision to increase defence spending to 2.5%. That's not an easy decision. Right? That is a decision that we've made. That's a choice that we've made. That's a priority that we think is right for the country. Keir Starmer and the Labour Party have been crystal clear that they don't believe in that. They will not match that choice. Right? So there's no way you can keep the country safe and secure from the growing threats we face. Iran, China, North Korea, Russia acting together, unless you are prepared to invest in our defence. It's as simple as that. There's a very clear dividing line there.
Iran, China, North Korea acting together. I don't really know what he's talking about. I mean, it's kind of like this axis of evil line where you associate, some fairly different countries and say they're all out to get us. I mean, if you look at what the headlines have been about China in recent years, is that they're flooding the global market with solar panels and electric cars. How awful, right? Is China really the menace they're making out, or is it the key to a green industrial revolution? Unsurprisingly, Keir Starmer has contested Sunak's claims.
We would not be less safe under a Labour government. A Labour government has always understood, and I understand very well, having worked on national security in my previous role when I was Director of Public Prosecutions. I know firsthand the importance of national security, which is why I've made such a commitment to the national security of our country. But in order to make that happen, you need a credible plan for the future. This government talks about national security, but what's its record? It's hollowed out our armed forces. It's wasted billions of pounds on procurement and doesn't have a credible plan for the future. We are much more serious than that, and that is because we're a changed Labour Party who puts our country first and our party second.
And that was about 50 seconds long, and I nearly nodded off for Ari. I kind of had to pinch myself. But Ash, I'm going to put this to you. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe Keir Starmer's strategy all this time has been to, on contentious issues, I'm going to be incredibly boring. And that's going to make it somewhat difficult for the Tories to attack me. They're 20 points ahead in the polls. It doesn't seem to have been the most unsuccessful strategy we've seen in recent political history.
I think we can both agree that Keir Starmer is a very boring man when he's on television. And when it comes to things like Labour's defence policy, he's really relied on the adulation from right-wing newspapers, The Times, sometimes even The Telegraph and the Daily Mail, to sort of lend him a sense of boosterism. So when Labour were making uncosted spending commitments to our public spending on defence, he was turning to right-wing papers to make that announcement. And then you get those sort of photo ops where he's being shot a little bit from below and he looks very dynamic. That is absolutely not how he presents himself on television. Again, I don't know whether that's by accident or by design. When it comes to this discussion about security, one of the things that struck me is that this is a very, very narrow definition of what it means to prioritize security in public policy. So obviously, when they're talking about security, what they're talking about is your military capabilities, right? Your ability to, deter what is thought of to be an alliance of hostile states. We don't really think about the ways in which our foreign policy actively makes the world a less stable, a less lawful, and overall a more unsafe place. And the reason why I'm thinking about it in those terms is, I don't know if you've been listening to the new series of Serial, which is a kind of New York Times co-run podcast. And this season, it's all about Guantanamo Bay. And in the most recent episode, which came out on Thursday, there was a fascinating interview with a member of Al-Qaeda, a former member of Al-Qaeda, who'd been detained at Guantanamo Bay in Camp 7 for years. He's the only person to have been released from Camp 7. So that means he was being held in the section of Guantanamo Bay alongside the likes of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, the architect of 9/11. And the beginning of this interview, he talked about why he joined Al-Qaeda. He wasn't a particularly strict or observant, fundamentalist Muslim. And in his words, he didn't even really have a problem with America. What he had a problem with was Israel, what Israel was doing to the Palestinians, and what he perceived to be America's support for that. He also became drawn into 9/11 conspiracy theories, and that was the beginning of his radicalization. But the thing that he said, which I found really interesting, is that in his view, America just hasn't learned those lessons, hasn't learned the lessons of 9/11 in terms of how its foreign policy, how its carte blanche that it offers to Israel in the continuing oppression and genocide of the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza, how that radicalizes people and creates new security threats for America. So when I'm hearing this mudslinging match between Sunak and Starmer, and of course it is a very tedious mudslinging match, this idea of security, the way in which you create new security threats by facilitating other countries to drive a coach and horses through international law, to commit war crimes in front of our very eyes, that is conspicuously absent from their pitch on security. So, yes, it will, result in, either a polling boost or at least not harming Keir Starmer in the polls. Yes, this will get him plaudits in the Daily Mail, the Times, and the Telegraph. Will it actually make Western countries safer to focus on military capability and also hitch our Apple wagon to the star of White House foreign policy to effectively give Israel a carte blanche in Gaza? No, I don't think it will make us more secure.
The Eurovision Grand Final was broadcast around the world on Saturday night, but it wasn't the camp crowd pleaser of previous years. Many of the acts, not to mention the audience, displayed their anger at the inclusion of one nation in the competition. This was the moment Israel's entry Eden Golan appeared on stage. The competition's final took place with strict rules in place for both the audience and the competitors. There were to be no overtly political statements or symbols, with all national flags other than those of the competitor nations banned from the auditorium. And in the run-up to the competition, several acts, including Ireland's Bambi Fugg and Sweden's Erik Saade, were rebuked for incorporating Palestinian symbolism in their costumes. But on the night, one performer managed to sneak a reference in. Portugal's Iolanda performed with this nail art inspired by the Palestinian keffiyeh. In response, Eurovision reportedly replaced the online version of her performance with a recording of her singing during the semi-final until the voting had closed. Eurovision's ban on political statements referring to Israel's genocide in Gaza stood in sharp contrast to its embrace of political partisanship over the last 2 years. In 2022, Eurovision banned Russia from the competition following its invasion of Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine would go on to win that year's competition. And at last year's competition in Liverpool, many acts loudly expressed solidarity with Ukraine, with Croatian avant-punk band Let Free permitted to perform an explicit anti-Putin, anti-war number. And it was amidst that apparent hypocrisy that after the jury votes had come in, this was the scoreboard. Switzerland stood well ahead of the rest of the field, followed by France and Croatia, and languishing somewhere in the middle was Israel, only a few points behind the UK. All of that changed, though, when the public votes were entered.
You have received 323 points.
As expected, it's a very big number for Israel.
Seems that we have a new leader.
Israel ultimately ended up in 5th place, with Switzerland taking the prize. And there's little doubt that supporters of Israel worked hard to improve Golan's popularity amongst the public. In New York's Times Square, the Israeli consulate erected a billboard encouraging people to vote for Golan. Probably a little less effective was this from sacked Israeli government spokesperson Eylon Levy.
Go to the Eurovision website, vote right now, number 6 for Israel. Vote 20 times. And who knows, maybe next year we'll see you in Israel as we celebrate Eurovision right here. We will dance again.
Vote 20 times. No, I'm not sure that sounds like someone particularly interested in free and fair elections. Many commentators took the public votes for Golan as indicating widespread support for Israel. This was Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's message to Golan after the competition. So he said, "They booed you and we shouted 12 points. I saw that you received almost the highest number of votes from the public, and this is the most important thing, not from the judges, but from the public, and you held Israel's head up high in Europe. You have brought immense pride to the state of Israel and the people of Israel. Congratulations." However, things are not as clear as Netanyahu wants to make out. The Eurovision Song Contest was also subject to a boycott, with Palestinians and pro-Palestinian activists encouraging people not to tune in, let alone vote, because of Israel's presence in the competition. And that boycott may have had an impact. Viewing figures in the UK this year plummeted, that was according to The Independent. On Saturday night, an average of 7.5 million people tuned into the show in Britain. That was down by a quarter on last year, when an average of 10 million people tuned in. But for those who didn't boycott, but who wanted to show their support for Gaza, their vote was always going to be split, right? Israel supporters had only one act to vote for, while pro-Palestinians had 24 to choose from. So in the absence of a coordinated voting campaign, which would have been a bit odd when the call was for a boycott, participating in Eurovision's public vote was never going to be an effective way for pro-Palestinians to make a point. So instead of using a singing competition to see where Europe stands on Israel's assault on Gaza, we can look to some recent polling conducted by YouGov for a clearer picture. Across France and Sweden, more than half of the population strongly supports or tends to support banning arms sales to Israel. In Italy and Belgium, that rises to almost 2/3, and even in highly pro-Israel Germany, 49% don't agree with their country selling arms to Israel. Ash. You know, we actually said on this show that we've only talked about Ollie Alexander and Israel, not Israel, the Eurovision Song Contest, when we talked about the boycott. I was saying on that show, I think Israel will do quite well because of the nature of it. I think if it was like Big Brother, where you voted for someone to evict, right, Israel would have come last. But because it's you only vote positively, there's obviously a lot of passionate pro-Israelis, a lot of passionate pro-Palestinians in Europe, but the pro-Palestinians didn't have anyone to vote for if they wanted to vote in the first place. So if you have a sort of motivated base, you can get people to vote for you, and Israel, did it somewhat effectively.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, Michael, because the call was to boycott Eurovision. So if you are an impassioned supporter of the Palestinian cause, you're not voting in the Eurovision Song Contest, you're boycotting it. Whereas if you are a pro-Israel advocate, what you've got to do is say, even if you don't watch the Eurovision Song Contest, just vote for this one person. So you were completely right to suggest that Israel were going to do well in the Eurovision Song Contest in a way which cuts against, is counter-directional to what the polling suggests about how European public opinion, where that falls on Israel's assault on Gaza. I mean, I didn't watch Eurovision this year, partly because of the boycott, and also because, in part, I'm not the most loyal Eurovision watcher there is on the planet. But the thing that I did keep an eye on was the way in which UK-based journalists, who love to present themselves as the impartial arbiters of sensible, fact-based journalism, were all sitting through Eurovision and talking about how awful it was that this young Israeli singer was being bullied and booed. And they were just clearly not enjoying themselves very much. They hated Eurovision, but they were watching it to spite those hateful pro-Palestine supporters. The main person I'm thinking of here is, of course, Andrew Neil, who is turning more and more into a Facebook granddad by the day. While it is in itself so undignified to pin your online identity to sitting through something that you hate just so you can vote for a singer who represents the pro-genocide position, while that is in itself really undignified, for me, the contrast between the way they were talking about this particular singer who made a choice to represent her country at a time where it stands accused of genocide and has a case to answer at the ICJ, the way in which they really honed in on her as a victim, while at the same time, Rafah is undergoing this sort of slow-moving ground invasion within a broader context of healthcare infrastructure, educational infrastructure, and aid distribution being utterly destroyed in Gaza. And I think there is something so profoundly racist about that, the way in which a 20-year-old woman's right to sing without being booed is given greater prominence, is considered more of a worthy victim than the thousands of Palestinians who have been buried under rubble, the Palestinians who are currently being held, as we'll discuss later, in what is effectively a torture camp, and the over 1 million Palestinians who face displacement and bombardment after being displaced to Rafah. And I think that tells you something about just how deep anti-Palestinian racism goes amongst the journalistic class of this country. I mean, I know we're talking about Eurovision, it's a silly thing, but the attitudes of journalists towards what is a pretty innocuous core demand, boycott Eurovision, I think is emblematic of a certain amount of racism.
CNN has spoken to 3 Israeli whistleblowers who have described shocking treatment of Palestinians held prisoners in a military base turned detention center. The base is located in the Negev desert inside Israel's borders, but close to Gaza. This is the account of one Israeli who worked there. His identity has been hidden.
We were told they are not allowed to move and must sit upright. They're not allowed to talk or peek under their blindfolds.
And what happened if they did do that? What kind of punishments were meted out?
We were allowed to pick out problematic people and punish them, having them stand with their hands above their heads for an unlimited time. If they didn't keep their hands up, we could zip tie them to the fence.
The Israeli military says detainees are handcuffed based on their risk level and health status. But the account tallies with photographic evidence obtained by CNN of Palestinian detainees inside Sidi Tamen, and with hand and wrist injuries shown to CNN by dozens of Palestinians released back into Gaza. I was zip-tied and blindfolded, says this former detainee, and tortured in a way I never imagined. One source telling us the restraints were so tight they had to amputate a man's hand.
The view that I've heard expressed is that, how do you think Israeli hostages are treated by Hamas?
This sentiment was voiced in the facility. But I think that if Hamas is so abominable, which I agree with, then why use Hamas as a bar? It's a descent into dehumanization.
It's clearly a descent into dehumanization. It's very brave for these sort of whistleblowers to come out and speak to the media. I mean, you do also have to worry, or wonder what's happening that we're not being told about, right? Let's look at some testimony from a second worker at the detention center.
You can take them out and hit them maybe 4 or 5 times with a club. It's not done in the face, so you don't see blood. The detainees lie belly down, being hit and kicked, people screaming and dogs barking at them. It's terrifying. Some detainees are taken away and beaten really hard, so bones and teeth are broken.
So you saw people who were subject to these beatings, who had their bones broken and who had their teeth broken?
Yes, it's a practice which commanders know about. They want intelligence, but they also want revenge and punishment. for what happened on October 7th.
The Israeli military hasn't approved CNN's requests for access to Sedi Taman. But at the gates of the facility, we challenged the Israeli guards.
How many Palestinians are in there right now? We don't know. Do you know if they're being handcuffed? Are they being blindfolded? No.
This is a facility.
As we leave, masked soldiers approach.
Hello, how are you?
Stop.
I'm filming this place.
It's a property of the army.
Oh.
So you
Who are you guys? I'm from CNN.
They tried to take our cameras.
Give me please now. Give me please now. Hang on, what is it that you want? My camera or my card?
Then order us to leave.
I mean, they really don't want people to know what's going on there, right? Trying to take the camera. And just this idea, you're hitting people with clubs, so you're breaking their bones and your teeth, right? And so he's saying that they partly want intelligence, this sort of Guantanamo style. We're using torture to get intelligence because we think the terrorist risk is so clear, right? Israel can very easily stop something like October the 7th happening, right? One of the reasons it was able to happen is because they moved so many of their soldiers over to the West Bank to try and help settlers steal land, right? If they'd been on the border, you know, if they'd sort of followed their intelligence properly, they could have stopped it. Obviously, nothing justifies breaking people's bones and teeth for intelligence, but they don't even need to do that anyway, which is where this idea of revenge comes in, right? These are people who are taking out their anger on Palestinians. I mean, I suppose that's the story of the whole war, really, isn't it? So the Israelis acting with anger to collectively punish 2 million people. And it's in these sort of secret detention centers where this is sort of done in the most brutal and sadistic fashion. Those two whistleblowers were workers there. I mean, this is a sort of army-based turned detention center, so potentially there were people who'd been drafted. CNN also spoke to a medic.
The problem is, Gazans who are brought in are labeled as terrorists, and it is very popular opinion over here that terrorists deserve to die, so they do not deserve the same medical care as everyone else.
Satellite imagery obtained by CNN shows how the Sedi Taman facility was expanded after the October 7th attacks, with detention facilities and makeshift medical bays being added after public hospitals in Israel refused to treat injured Gazan suspects. Eyewitness accounts describe a field hospital with 15 to 20 patients, virtually naked and blindfolded, with hands and feet shackled to their beds and wearing diapers. One eyewitness told CNN painful procedures were carried out by underqualified medics. Treatment, the medical worker told us, amounts to punishment.
In my view, it's the idea of total vulnerability. If you imagine being unable to move, being unable to see what's going on, that's something that borders, if not crosses, into psychological torture.
I mean, I would say that clearly crosses into psychological torture. I mean, imagine you're lying there, you're already injured, you've got your hands and your feet, padlocked, handcuffed to your bed, you've got your eyes covered, people are operating on you, you've got absolutely no idea what's going on, you're just feeling intense pain and presumably like confusion, right? That would drive you completely mad, I think, not having any idea where you are, not being able to move, not being able to see. You see this time and time again, don't you, Ash, where sort of the moment you label someone a terrorist, you can treat them, not morally, of course, but sort of psychologically, however you want, however sadistic it might seem, however inhumane, they are now a terrorist and they're sort of subhuman, so you can do what you want.
I mean, this was one of the tactics of the war on terror. Those who were labelled terrorists were termed unlawful combatants. And because they were labelled unlawful combatants, it was argued by America at that time that the rules of law didn't apply to them. Now, this is exactly the language that has been used by Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant to say that those who they deem to be Hamas terrorists, which doesn't necessarily mean that they are not to be considered as enemy combatants of an enemy army. They're to be considered unlawful combatants, so the rules of war don't apply. I think there are a lot of parallels that you can draw between this particular torture camp and, again, the infrastructure of torture and detention that existed during the War on Terror. Of course, a lot of that infrastructure does still exist on a smaller scale. What America did was that it operated its torture camps, its detention facilities, where those who were accused of being unlawful combatants and held without charge. You, of course, had CIA-run black sites. Many of the prisoners there were acquired through rendition. They were essentially either passed from American custody into the custody of states whose operatives carried out the torture to create this kind of plausible deniability. All these men were victims of rendition into American hands. Guantanamo is, of course, infamous, but the worst torture was carried out by the CIA. What makes Israel different is that Israel is unable to use an international infrastructure of detention and torture. It doesn't have that layer of plausible deniability by saying this is happening outside of our jurisdiction, or really technically it's being carried out by another sovereign state. This is happening on Israeli occupied land where Israel claims sovereignty, claims Israeli law, is supposedly subject to international law, and quite clearly this horrendous torture, and it is torture, to be handcuffed, blindfolded, and forced into a nappy without the basic dignity of being able to use the bathroom. That is torture, right? I don't really care what the legal thresholds are. If that happened to you, you would consider that torture. All of this is being carried out in a way which shows that Israel doesn't fear the repercussions of international law. It's unable to have the same kind of international infrastructure that America used, but also they don't need that same infrastructure that America used because of the radicalization of the Israeli civilian population, which is broadly in favor of even more use of force against the Palestinians. And it also doesn't fear being held accountable through the means of international law because of the diplomatic protection that is afforded by the US and also the UK and Germany as well. So what is going on in that camp is disgusting. There's shared culpability, I think, with Western nations, even if it's not our operatives who directly have blood on their hands. We helped create the context in which something like this is possible.
I think that's pretty much inarguable. Ash Sarkar, thank you so much for joining me for your contributions this evening.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
And thank you everyone for watching. Come back tomorrow for another stream. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.